What's going on? You're watching the Morris Code. This week, we're getting personal. We're going to speak about something that everyone has, but we rarely like to speak about it. Because of COVID-19, it's something that's come to the forefront for many people, and that is debt. Debt is something that many people struggle with in silence. This week, we'll be speaking with Francisco Remolino of Remolino and Associates, a debt and insolvency trustee. And by the end of the conversation, you will hopefully be able to figure out there is possible light at the end of the tunnel. Hey everyone, hope you're all doing well. As promised, I'd like to introduce you to my guest today, Francisco Remolino of Remolino and Associates, a licensed insolvency trustee. Francisco, how are you doing?
Good, thank you, and thank you for having me today.
You're quite welcome. So let's get straight to it. What exactly is a licensed insolvency trustee?
An LIT, short for a licensed insolvency trustee, is an officer of the court. It's a professional who provides advice and services to businesses and individuals with debt problems.
When I hear insolvency and I hear debt and bankruptcy, etc., like myself, most people tend to have a fear of the words bankruptcy or consumer proposal. But according to stats, which surprised me, is that the average self-made millionaire has filed for bankruptcy at least once. Why is that?
Well, it's actually a great question because I think we need to back up to understand that talking about finances has always been an intimate topic. That is reserved mostly to a conversation with a close family member or a friend. Okay. So hence the stigma to speak publicly about it. So either by the lack of education around money management or simply our fear or shame around mismanagement, most people prefer to suffer in silence and try to figure out on their own. What I see though is fear creates this cycle of shame that results on an individual's decision not to look for information and just to avoid that sense of failure. But to your question about the myth of the self-made billionaires that file for bankruptcy, then we're really talking about people that take on great risks financially. So for business people, not surprisingly, due to the ups and downs of their business ventures, bankruptcy becomes an option to get out of a business that has failed and just move forward. So it is certainly an option that a lot of people use just to get out of a bad business that doesn't really work well.
Okay. So I know we spoke a bit about a couple of things, but based on what you just mentioned here, I've been of the strong belief, and I've heard a lot of people say that you should treat yourself or your finances like a business in terms of expenses, managing, budgeting, etc. So if you're supposed to treat yourself like a business, when would you say is the best time for an individual to see you about your services?
And it's a great introduction because the basics example of treating yourself as a business is having a budget, and I think it's actually well known that a lot of people refuse to follow a budget because it's been seen that if you have a budget, then it's because your income is limited, which is not the case. And I think having a budget is a great tool to also see exactly how much money is coming in and where is my money going. So from that perspective, I think treating yourself as a business makes a lot of sense. To your question about when is the best time to seek for my services, in an ideal world, anybody, a business, an individual that is going through some financial times, and they don't really know what to do with the finances, there should be more of a preventable approach to that, and then trying to get the information before it's too late. But the reality is, I think part procrastination and part hope that things are going to get better. Most people, most businesses reach out when the options are limited. So when they know that they have to do something. I think part of my approach is to always discuss what are the options available. So where are you at today? What brought you to be where you are today? And what can we do? Even though considering the options that are not necessarily part of my role as trustee, I think once you provide the business, the individual with different options, they are better prepared to take on the option they feel is the better for themselves.
Okay, great. So explain to us how a proposal or bankruptcy is determined and the best option on how for the process to work.
Sure. In a general concept, the first thing we do as a trustee, we have to do an initial assessment. So we sit down with the individuals, we sit down with the business owners or the accountants of the business, whoever is representing the business. But I say in this particular case, let's say with an individual, so we sit down and we look into the key elements that are going to tell us exactly where you are at in order to assess the situation. And we're looking into liabilities, we're looking into what kind of creditors do you have and how much you owe into them and for how long. Do you have a secure or unsecured creditor? So what type of creditors are those? We're looking into assets. What properties do you have? What properties have you had? That's also very important. We're looking into income. We're looking into the individual's income, but we're looking into the household income. And I will get back to this in a minute. We're looking also into the family composition. That's also important. We're looking into previous insolvencies. And all these elements, part of this discussion is trying to figure out how each of these elements will play a role in making the best decision. Because when it comes to insolvency, we have to really look at the decision at solution that is going to take you to a best financial position, right? So when we look into that, then there are we're going to do this in two separate ways. We're going to look into individuals, so people that come and look for options, and we're looking for businesses. So in terms of individuals, we have two different options, and we have the consumer proposals or proposals, and we also have bankruptcy. So a proposal is an agreement that is presented to the creditors to repay a portion of an individual's debt. And this repayment can be made either by a monthly payment for up to 5 years or as a lump sum amount if for some reason there is an amount available to make an agreement with the creditors that way. For the most part, most proposals are made at monthly basis. The way the process really works is that the initial 60 days are the negotiation part of the proposal, which includes the 45 days for the creditor's approval and then 50 more days for a court approval. What it really means is that during the first 45 days is still the negotiation part of the proposal, in which the creditors may come back and ask for a payment to be increased or amended. So that is the part where everything is negotiated. Okay. But once the proposal is approved, which is approved with a simple majority of 50 plus one of the votes, considering the number of creditors, then it's actually a very straightforward process. The one rule, though, in terms of approvals of a proposal, which I think has also being somehow misused in the general public in the terms of selling what a consumer proposal is. And some people say, well, you can forgive up to 90% of your debts. And there's no such a rule. There's not a rule of a percentage. But the only rule that says about proposal is that it has to be better to the creditors than the individual filing for bankruptcy. In other words, the proposal has to be more advantageous to the creditors than this individual filing for bankruptcy. And so, as such, the consumer proposal is a comparable scenario between a consumer proposal and a bankruptcy, which is what's presented in the documents.
Okay.
So, again, once the proposal is approved, let's talk about the pros and cons. And the pros, one of the benefits of the proposal is that the payment is fixed. There's no interest added to it. To me, that adds a level of certainty that is what most people really require, in the sense that, you're going from a situation that is very uncertain and all this dealing with different creditors at the same time. And then now you have an option in which you make an agreement and you agree to pay X amount of money, and that's that. So there's no changes on that. One of the other benefits is that even though the consumer proposal is agreed to be paid up to 5 years, once approved, it can be paid sooner than that. So the individual don't have to wait for the full 5 years. If there's some extra money coming in, then it can be paid faster, which I think is also great. In terms of the cons, I would say it will affect the credit report. And just so we all kind of have an idea, the credit report goes from R1, which is the best, to R9. In a consumer proposal, it will go to R7 during the time of the proposal, plus 3 more years. And when I said during the time of the proposal, it could be the full 5 years or whatever time the person takes to pay the proposal, plus 3 more years. What it really means is that during that time, an individual will not be able to have any unsecured debts, which is what most people have in terms of credit cards, lines of credit, and loans, and every type of credit for which there's no guarantee. Do you have any questions about proposals? Because now we're going to move to bankruptcies.
No, it seems pretty much straightforward. What surprised me with from the consumer proposal was the number of years plus the 3. I think myself and people I've spoken to always thought that, okay, yes, the proposal is there, you pay it off, but you're able to reestablish credit a lot. You're able to reestablish credit a lot faster. And I think that's somewhat of the story that I think a lot of people think, that if I do a proposal versus a bankruptcy, I can get back on my feet a lot quicker. Is that true or false?
No, it is true in the sense that it could be quicker if you pay the proposal sooner, right? So if the proposal is up to 5 years, and then if you take the 5 years plus 3, it's going to be 8. But if you pay it sooner, so if you say you take 2 or 3 years, then it's going to be 6.
Okay.
The reality is, up until the last changes in the legislation in 2009, there was a more advantage to do a proposal versus bankruptcy. I think things were a little more clear, but right now the real advantage of either option, a consumer proposal or bankruptcy, is cost. Because as we're going to discover in the bankruptcy, a bankruptcy entails a different process in which there's a little more things involved as opposed to what most people think. But this is to say that I think there's still benefit on filing a consumer proposal than if you have the ability to commit to a payment.
Okay. So saying that then, let's get into bankruptcies. and how it differs, how much it differs from consumer proposals. I think for most people, we hear a lot more about bankruptcies versus consumer proposals. I know about consumer proposals because I worked in the banking industry at one point in time. So you'd come across people applying for credit, etc., and you'll see that they maybe went through a consumer proposal at some point in time in their life, right? But bankruptcy is something that everyone hears about, right? We've heard some of the most famous people in the world, even one south of the border, went bankrupt numerous times. So what's the main difference and the benefits, I would say, of going bankrupt? And I know the laws are different country to country, but here in Canada, what's the benefits of it and how does it actually work?
Right. And I think it's fair to say that the bankruptcy probably carries the most stigma around insolvency, and so there's a bit of apprehension to even discuss bankruptcy. I have a lot of people come into my office, and the very first thing they say is, "I don't want to go bankrupt," which is, I mean, I understand that, but I also think it's important to know the legalities of it, to know the process, to see whether or not this is the process. This is what the best option to you, right? So bankruptcy, from simple terms, is the legal declaration of an individual's inability to pay his or her debts. So they say to the creditors through a legal document, I don't have any, I'm not able to pay your debts anymore. Okay. However, it's a little more complicated than that, because and again, most of these changes came into effect in 2009. During the bankruptcy, there are two things that are very important to determine the cost of the bankruptcy and the fees. One of them is income. What is this individual income, but more so, what is this individual's household income? Because even though an individual, let's say somebody files for bankruptcy, there is a standard that has been created by the superintendent of bankruptcy to determine the portion of this individual's income that has to be paid during the bankruptcy period. Which is called the surplus income calculation, and that surplus income calculation is actually very straightforward, in the sense that it's given by the number of people in the household, and what they say is if an individual of a single household files for bankruptcy, currently they are allowed to keep $2,223 a month, but anything above that, they will have to pay 50% of their income to the creditors. So the point here is, if somebody files for bankruptcy, they need to understand that a portion of the income, if it goes above this standard, will have to be paid to the creditors. That's the number one element. Number two is assets. So what assets, what properties the individual have that will have to go to the creditors. And this is to say a couple things, that when somebody files for bankruptcy, the technicality of it is that whatever properties this individual have that will have to go to the creditors, now the trustee will have to realize them, sell them, and give this money to the creditors. It's also fair to say that there's a list of assets that can be that are exempted, and therefore the individual can't keep those assets. For example, a vehicle that is worth up to $6,600, and household furniture can be kept. Personal effects, they all are protected up to $11,500. RSPs, except the contributions that were made for the 12 months prior to the bankruptcy, and there's some more. The point is, assets are important. There are some of them that are exempted, so they're protected and can be kept, but there are other assets that are not. And so when we're looking at the bankruptcy scenario, we have to look into those assets that are not protected and what is the actual realizable value of those assets. So, for example, let's say, and especially in Ontario, there's no exemption for the primary residence. So if an individual has a house, and just for the sake of the example, I'm going to say this house is worth $200,000, and there's a mortgage for $150,000, and the equity, which is the amount that is left, is $50,000. Then that $50,000 is basically the value that represents to the creditors. So in other words, if this individual is to file for bankruptcy, we need to consider this value of the house that will go to the creditors. So you probably remember when I mentioned that a consumer proposal is a comparable between a bankruptcy and a proposal, and the proposal has to be better. So what I normally do, I go through this exercise with everybody as looking at both the bankruptcy and the proposal in order to make sure that the proposal is in fact better to the creditors. So it's an exercise that it has to be done, or is better done with a trustee that has the experience and the knowledge to do this. But I think what is important to know is if somebody wants to file for bankruptcy, it's not just a simple decision to say, sure, I file for bankruptcy and I don't have to pay anything. Things have really changed, and yes, there's some payments that either come from your income or come from your assets. So I think those two elements are very, very important when it comes to a bankruptcy, for sure.
Okay. So before I go into the next question, something in what you were saying when we first started speaking, before we even started the interview, I asked you how business was going. And you said that you've had a lot of people coming in asking you about options, etc. In the midst of COVID-19, a lot of small businesses, unfortunately, failing or are on the ropes, as they say. And people are looking for options overall. Have you seen an uptick in the number of people looking for options and assistance? And B, do you provide a service if someone, instead of looking to file for bankruptcy of a proposal to help get their finances or get their business up and running again?
And that's a great question. And the answer to that is yes. There has been an increase on either online requests or calls for both individuals and businesses looking for information. I think a lot of people is trying to get information, but as I mentioned to you, what makes it a little more a little harder at this point is that people is dealing with their personal lives in terms of losing of employment or losing business income, and therefore now they have to also face debt, and how they're going to deal with this in a moment that is probably they're just being forced to deal with that. What I normally do is I go through this assessment of what assets and liabilities and all of that to determine whether or not is bankruptcy really the option, or can they consider other options prior to bankruptcy, such as a consolidation loan or credit counseling. So there are other options that are pre-insolvency that I think is worth for people to look into. Just so they also know they do their own due diligence, right? So I think I prefer that we go through these options and then we look into that. I only do what I'm licensed to do, which is proposals and bankruptcies. But if that is part of the conversation, then I say, well, go to your bank and talk to them and see what they can do. Same thing with the bank, with the business. I think with the business, the idea of a business is to explore whether or not the business is viable. problem with a lot of the business though is there's a personal attachment to it. So it's so for business owners, they're not just giving up the business; they're just giving out. It's like a baby for them, and so they've been working on this business for many years. So there's a very strong personal attachment to it. But I think it allows me to then show that, you know, this business has not been working for the last 2 or 3 years. This is just the last drop in that you were, you know, waiting for this to happen, and therefore now you're forced to make a harder decision. When it comes to a business, then you also need to understand if this business is no longer viable. You know, what else are you going to do? I mean, then you look from the business perspective to the individual perspective, trying to at least get them to think about other options. So I think the insolvency process, as much as it is a very technical process, it's also a very personal process in the sense that you have to make some hard decisions sometimes. And again, luckily for me, I have the ability to be a little more understanding and more compassionate about everybody's personal story, to say, okay, you know, I understand what we're doing, but this is what we should do. And the process can be very practical, but I also understand the personal ramifications that come with that too.
Okay, so I can say you're part psychologist, part financial guru then. So, other question I had for you was just going back to debt and what can and cannot be paid out. Can all debt be wiped clean? I've heard in the past that, for example, HST and taxes are the one thing that you cannot get rid of if you owe the government. Can you get further into that?
Yeah, for sure. So, yes, I think there's a lot of probably lack of information around what tax debt and how to handle that from an insolvency perspective. And what I can say is CRA is an unsecured creditor to most of the accounts they have, meaning they can be included in an insolvency, either a bankruptcy or a proposal. So, for example, for an individual, personal income tax and HST for a sole proprietor can be included in an insolvency, bankruptcy or proposal. In a corporation, we're looking at corporate taxes are unsecured, as well as HST, except that in a corporation, the HST is also a director's liability, meaning if the corporation for some reason disappears or goes bankrupt, then CRA can very well assess the directors for the HST debt. Now, it will go to the directors as an unsecured debt, but it's still a debt. So that's why it's also important to, when assessing a business insolvency, is, you know, who else is this going to affect? And sometimes making a proposal to repay the business debts makes more sense from the business perspective, to avoid the personal liability that it will create for the HST accounts. In terms of the payroll, which is source deduction, so the source deduction, which is EI and TPP, and those have to be paid within 6 months of the insolvency. So source deductions are considered a super priority, and they will have to be paid.
Wow. Okay. Very interesting. You really educated me right there, because I was always under the impression they could not be wiped out at all. So thank you very much. I think that would answer my question and a question for a lot of people out there.
Now, there is also something about CRA. So CRA is a very unique entity and a very unique creditor in itself. And I think they have some powers that most people is also not aware of. So one of the those powers that I've seen for the last many years is that there's a section in the Income Tax Act, which is a Section 160, in which CRA can assess a third party for transfers that were made during the time a debt was owed to CRA. For example, an individual owes, let's say, $50,000 to CRA, and he decided that while that was clarified, he transferred, let's say, his house to his spouse or daughter or a family member or whatever. So what CRA does, and most people actually do this kind of transfer thinking that, well, if I don't have any assets, there's nothing they can do. But then now CRA has the power by using this section of the Income Tax Act to assess the third party, because the third party technically enriched from an asset that was initially to pay CRA, and now this third party is responsible. So you have to be very careful when there is a debt to CRA, whether or not it's determined. I mean, whether or not you know that it's 10,000 or 20 or 100, to do any kind of transactions or gifts of any sort while this is happening, because you can also create a problem to somebody else.
Okay. Wow. Okay, great. That's fantastic info, Francisco. So, any last comments before we sign off?
I think the one thing that I would like everybody to take out of this is, having the discussion around money and more so about debts is never an easy discussion, but I think it's important to know that there are options available, that trustees are available to have this discussion and provide with the information that you need. It's also very important to know that once you take care of your debts, then you will be in a better position to move forward, to think about other strategies, but more so to consider doing things in a different way. So I think part of what I do is trying to create a space for individuals to come to my office, take care of their debts, and then move on. Because the reality is that's one of the process. The premises of the process is that somebody has a fresh start, and I think it's important to know that there are options, and there's also a future and hopefully a fresh start.
Okay, great. So if anyone watching this video, which I hope turns into the millions one day, wants to contact you to speak to you about a personal situation, and of course I know it will be done in all privacy, what is the best way for them to contact you?
I can be reached out by email or by phone. My office phone number is 416-792-5599, or by email at remolino@remolinoassociates.com.
Okay. And do you happen to have a website?
I do. So my website, which is also a good source of information, is remolinoassociates.com. And there are a lot of information in this website in terms of the options and how they work, and all possible questions you can come across, they most likely already answered there.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. Hope to see you again soon. And again, thank you. Talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I hope we can do it again in the future. Thanks a lot.
Definitely. Thank you.